Kathleen is
Margaret on the phone?
right
Margaret's
now.
on the phone. Yeah, Margaret's on the phone. Oh, there's Kathleen. Hi, Kathleen. And now we're really good.
Now we're cooking with gas.
Yes, right. We couldn't start without you, Kathleen. Thank you.
Oh, great.
Literally this time, Kathleen. Literally, we couldn't start without you.
Exactly.
I'm sure you could have.
You are free to start whenever you would like.
Okay, thank you. All right. Well, it is now 6:01, so I would like to officially call the Board of Ed Strategic Planning Committee meeting to order. President, we have myself, Miss Holes, and well, we'll just have Kathleen and Margaret, and we also have Jonathan. Margaret is joining us by phone, so there will be no video. All right, so everybody got their massive packet, I presume, whether they had a hard copy or received it via email. And Dr. De Silva, what do you think the best way to go through this is? Or
so feeder patterns is where we start, and then transportation second on the agenda. There actually happened to be one report that you can disregard for now that was part of your packet, which was around transportation. With all of our research on some of the reports, Cheryl had found a few on transportation, which may come in handy later, but we don't need them quite yet. So you'll notice it's in your packet. You can ignore it. It's from EduLog.
Okay.
In terms of how best to tackle it, perhaps a conversation around what was shared on Friday. I know it was a lot. I think it was like 120 pages. So I'm not sure how many folks had time to read or didn't. You know, but perhaps you can just take a look at some of the documents that are there and process what you have been able to obtain from them. And I hope, Liz, they're not in that giant binder, because that's a lot of paper.
No, I keep all of my door to bed. I was switching gears from my day job. Sorry.
I was feeling guilty for the trees.
No, this is just my taking notes notebook. I've got it up on digital.
Yes, it's a much smaller binder.
Yes.
There's my pad. Okay, so who would be best to walk us through what we received? Was it?
Well, I can do that. Let me just, I'm going to review the packet the same way that I have it, if you have it electronically. So there was a lot of digging, and I think Cheryl tried to put these in order the best that she could in terms of providing some type of timeline. So
right.
the first study you have was a presentation by EduLog, and when you see education logistics, just so you know, that's and maybe that's primarily what we do today. I'm not sure how many folks had the time to read, but the first study was from Education Logistics, also known to us as EduLog, and they provided the board with a report on November 30th of 2010. So we're about 11 years out. And that was a preliminary school closures model. And so that was a pretty lengthy study. You're going to notice that there's a Dr. Chung, I believe, and I believe that that's the demographer that we used prior to Malone McBroom. So that's the first study that you'll notice in your packet. Again, a lot of pages. So let me get to the next one. The second one is actually the one you can ignore for now on page 47. If you're looking at your packet electronically, that was the one that snuck in there. We probably will look at that in the future, but not there yet. That was a transportation update that was provided to the board at that time. That was in 2011. It may connect into the 2010 somehow, but I don't think you'll need that quite yet. Then if you keep going to 2016, you have a discussion on potential options for the schools relative to the capacity study. So you'll notice in 2016, which is obviously just about 5 years ago, where our enrollment was at that time, the capacity for each of our sites and the utilization of those sites. in the recommendations that were provided. And then that was also by Malone and McBroom, which was our demographer at that time. And I believe there's a couple more here. So let me just get through all of that. Then in 2017, also by Malone and McBroom, there was a discussion of potential scenarios and options for the 2017-18 school year. Again, another study. It was relative to recommendations for discussion around viable options for elimination and scenarios for schools. And that's where you actually see the reconfiguration. If you remember, we discussed briefly the last time we were here, which was a pre-K to 4 in a 5 through 8 site, and then the closing of SES. And I think that was the last one. Let me see if there was another one in there. Actually, and then there was one more memorandum that came in February 2017 that had the 50-50. That was a report to the members of the board from Karen Baldwin, Dr. Baldwin, who discussed the 50-50 split and the changes to Scotts Ridge Middle School from the capacity of a 40-60. So those are the reports that are included in your packet. How best to tackle them, I think, really depends on how much folks have had the time to read or study them or have any insights on them.
I guess I'd be curious, Susie, how much have you had a chance to dig into this, and what's your sort of top line perspective? I mean, I flipped through them, but it's a lot of data without, you know, and yeah, there's a lot of options, but the options are kind of high level. I mean, they're not, it's closed Scotland, you know, I get that part of it, but do you agree with the forecasting? Obviously this doesn't take into account things like facilities age and capital improvements required to be contemporary opportunities to give buildings to this town at, you know, for certain revenue opportunities, that sort of thing. So it's sort of one piece of the whole pie. But so I wonder what your thoughts are as you read through this. Do you feel like it's a good starting point? It's not a good starting point. It's nice information to have, but we start over. I mean,
a little bit of both, Liz. So the challenge for me was actually trying to put the pieces together and how they connected with one another, and just from an educational perspective, where I might position myself. So I think if you were looking at this now and you're looking at the capacity study, I think that's probably the one that's the most pertinent. I think the 50-50 feeder study that was done by Dr. Baldwin, ultimately we know how that ended, right? Where we are now and why we're looking to make shifts. The third piece, which is more of an educational piece, is just the historical perspective on that shift from the educational model from a pre-K 4 to a 5-8. So ultimately, you know, at a high level, all the things that you just described could possibly be options, right? You can take one school, make it a bigger school, take down another school, give that school back to the town, look at other options for schools, certainly, and looking at the age of some of these buildings and providing more time for that. It really depends on where this committee and or the board would like to land 3, 5, 7 years from now. And I think it's too early for me to weigh in. From an educational perspective, I don't think I would have ever put a 5 through 8 model on the table. But that's for a bigger, broader discussion, I think, wherever we project to land or hope to land.
If I could jump in for a second, what I took out of these packets that we went through over the weekend, the Malone and McBroom, January 9, 2017, on its page 3, it lists 3 scenarios and says viable, 2 of which we've done, 1 we didn't, and then 4 that say not viable. I think we should look at those and see if the reasons they were not viable then are still in existence, if those are for whatever reason now viable, and if they are, there's something that we want to dig into. And then on the prior, I believe it was on the 2010 packet, there were a few options that sounded like were viable if, and the if being an expansion of some sort at Scotts Ridge. So that's another thing that I think we should discuss is, is there value to putting forward a request to expand Scouts Ridge if X, Y, or Z, if it does allow us to close another building somewhere else, or if it does help alleviate concerns with the downstream effect of the aligned feeder patterns. So that's where I would start with this meeting, is going through some of those not viable then and kind of revisiting those. Also, one of them, which was not viable then, was a reconfiguration to a 10 through 12 high school and a 6 through 9 middle school, which I guess where we sit today makes no sense whatsoever, because the high school is has this declining enrollment. We don't need to take another grade out of it,
Right.
and the middle schools are over enrolled. So it was interesting that not so many years ago it was listed as a scenario for consideration.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Can I just answer that question for you, Jonathan?
Sure. I
Please.
forgot we had the historian on the line.
I know, but so the reason is because the declining enrollment was going from the elementary schools into the middle schools. So when you say the middle schools are over enrolled, not exactly. The feeder pattern has made Scotts Ridge over enrolled, but collectively they're not. So at the time was planning for, if there's lower enrollment at both middle schools collectively, could we then move 9th grade into that? So that was the original conversation that just made them look at that scenario.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, all right. So if we start, let's that is a great idea. So
Ken froze, but I think just
We
back.
buy Ken a hotspot or something.
Yeah. But to go back to Liz's point earlier, I think the overarching question for this.
Yes.
Oh,
Oh,
you're back. I think you're back.
okay. Sorry, that wasn't all that important. So if we start with the 2017 and with the first not viable, is that in your opinion, and I guess Karen's going to have the most information on it. Is that something that's still not viable?
May I just take a step back, Ken? I think
Sure.
what might be helpful is what are we looking to solve for, right? If
Sure.
we start there, are we looking to solve for the Scotts Ridge, East Ridge challenge? One, I think that's definitely one, right? And then if we can conceptualize perhaps what else are we looking to solve for? Is it Liz threw out a bunch of ideas, right? Are we looking to get back a building? Are we looking to look at our buildings and determine, what is their lifespan, let's just say, and how much investment are we putting into these buildings, whether it's through bits and pieces in operating or on the capital side. That might be and then looking at these documents, I think might be the natural
context.
Yeah. That's what I was missing in this, is that's why I asked you, Susie, because there's no context. I mean, look, whoever was involved in this had context. They were trying to your point, solve for a specific issue.
Right.
And that's why I was wondering if it's good, interesting information, but is it really even relevant? I mean, it's a lot of data, but how relevant is it? I don't know. But I do think we should think about, to your point, what are we trying to solve for? Are we trying to bring down the tax burden on the town, because that's part of our job, while still maintaining high quality education for every student in Richfield, right? Those are two things. We also know we have aged buildings. Some of the elementary schools are probably not as low investment to get to the next level. We also know we have an opportunity that's relatively short term for the town to want to take some of that land, but that's a finite decision point, right? Yeah. So as that happens, we have an opportunity to start to look at things differently. And one of the things we have to consider is, do we want to maintain a swim team? Because that building may not maintain it for very much longer if you look without significant renovations. Do we want to maintain? We've got Tiger Hollow maintenance. We've got, 2 middle schools that have enrollment challenges right now. Are there other things that we want to consider to be competitive in the marketplace as well, that we need to be thinking about now that are 3 to 5 years out that require bonding? Those are the kind of things I would love to start to consider in advance. List them all out. Like, hey, let's start weighting each one of these requirements that we have and start to think through, because all of them are factors, if then factors, and they're big decisions. But if I look at, Scotland and Barlow and I go, wow, is that land really being used effectively for what's the future of education? I'm a layman, but I'd say, I don't know. If I look at VP and say, what's the future there of the smallest school that's also one of the oldest and has the most need for both interior and exterior renovations, are we putting good money after bad, or should we think about a different plan there? So I think there are some really big things we should be starting to frame out to bring to the community to talk about. And I think they are what you said, Susie. First of all, what's the future of the education of need in Richfield? What is it that both classroom amenities and extracurricular amenities? Do we need more different science labs? Do we need different music facilities because ours are dirty and dusty and old? Do we need different athletic facilities to be competitive in the marketplace? Because that helps everyone in the town, both the kids and the taxpayers. Can we do it with what we have? Plus declining enrollment. And how do we start to shift that? I think and we know we have a desire for, there's a big push in the town, or at least a vocal one, to look at start times and bus routing and optimization. And of course, I have a big passion around optimizing cost around transportation. So, I think these are all data factors that we should be starting to think about. And this report has some of that data. It doesn't have all of it.
No,
and I think we need to put it all together and make that case.
Yeah.
The only thing that I'd add to that, Liz, is that there's some short-term problems that we're going to need to tackle far sooner than later, and how we navigate those. Again, I think memorializing exactly what we're looking to do and identify those in a short-term, perhaps long-term.
Long-term, yeah. Dr. De Silva, to that point, what are some of your short-term goals for?
That's a hard question, Ken.
Okay.
And the reason ultimately we need to figure out the space issue at Scotts Ridge. That's a short-term fix, right? What you don't want to be in a position is to play whack-a-mole. Right. So if, maybe stuck again, Ken, but if we're looking to, when you're thinking about innovation in schools and you look at our buildings, there's no doubt that take a walk through, like Liz said, Veterans Park, even some of our newer buildings, there's an aesthetic piece to it, but there's also an innovation piece to it. We've made a lot with a little. Some of those maker spaces, yes, you can do the work there, but they're environments that aren't welcoming, that you're literally, making a maker space because the environment doesn't lend itself in that way. It doesn't lend itself to how kids learn now, collaboratively, independently, differently. Some kids learn in big groups, some kids learn small, some kids want to shift from standing to sitting. We're just making do within those spaces. So I do think that there's opportunities for growth and innovation, but that's got to come with a bigger, broader discussion. I think the original charge that we had was, how are we going to navigate the enrollment and how this is going to impact our schools? And I think this year we've seen it with Scotts Ridge, where even in a hybrid capacity, we're tight. And now bring in more kids where we're next year, for example, where we're even, or even more so at Scotts Ridge. We have to start rethinking that. So there may be some short-term fixes and then some long-term.
So I would just agree with that and say that as far as my concerns, short term are Scotts Ridge enrollment and size. High school enrollment going forward with another 10% decline heading our way in the next 5 years. Optimization around transportation, but a lot of that depends on who we're transporting and where. And then, like Liz said, perhaps looking at whether or not bell times fits into that whole discussion.
And I think we've said, to jump on what Jonathan just said, is if, we really need to adjust the Scotts Ridge Middle School system quickly, because if we want to make it so it has the least impact on all families, we want to start quickly so that it doesn't happen to families in the middle of it happens as seamlessly as possible for children moving in and not having to switch mid being in an elementary school. So that I see as really just, staring us right in the face. And then hopefully as we're doing all this, we can think bigger and broader rather than targeted.
No, that makes sense, Kathleen. Yeah, no, that space issue does seem to be the high priority of the short term, the shortest of the terms of what we need to address.
Do we value the aligned feeder patterns?
Yes. That happened while I was here. I don't know what the community response was, but it certainly makes a heck of a lot of sense. They changed while my children happened to be in that grade. So there was a few kids who were impacted. We were not, but a few kids who were impacted. And it seems to, since then, it's been a positive thing, it seems like, from a parent perspective. But I'd love to hear what others have heard. I have not heard any feedback from anyone other than that year that it happened, that it was, took the transition for a couple of kids, but I haven't heard anything negative or positive. I haven't heard anything about it, to be fair.
I would think, in terms of social, social emotional well-being, particularly at those ages, for children to go with a cohort of students that they've been with, is really a positive. There are the few children that a change might be good, but I think for the most, any educator or any psychologist would say that that's a healthy pattern. Wouldn't you agree, Dr. De Silva?
Yeah, transitioning from fifth to sixth, you're 100% right, is that some kids can handle change independent of others. But there is something about having peers that when you transition into quote unquote a big middle school, even though ours aren't really, they're not that big. But transitioning from an elementary school to a middle school experience without having peers that you connect with can be incredibly challenging for some kids more than others. I am going to go to our resident historian who remembers when this happened, and she remembers the parent point of view. And it didn't impact everyone, but Karen, why don't you share a little bit about what you remember from that time?
Yeah, sure. So it was Barlow and Scotland that had kids that would go to both Eastridge and Scotts Ridge. So, because it had been in place so long, people just knew who was going to which school. So yes, parents did like overall that all kids would be going to the same place. However, just from experiencing it, because I was a parent that had a child that went to one school and our friends went to the other school, as well as just being in the district, kids acclimate. So I wouldn't say that it was social emotionally detrimental overall, just because of, people acclimated to that as well. But yes, it was more of a transition when we changed because of who was already going to a particular school. So then we would have, neighbors going to different schools for those 3 years. So maybe Liz, you're familiar with that as well, where there were some challenges as we made that transition from the split to the 50-50 split.
Karen, how much notice did they have, or Liz? Was it just
not much? It was really during a budget decision. So late into the, early spring and into the spring. And it was not something that was really discussed.
Yeah, and the only thing I remember there being any real scuttlebutt on too was siblings. That was a thing.
Right. So that if you had a brother that was in 7th grade, you were upcoming 5th grader into 6th grade, that kind of thing.
Interesting. And that, well, that, and again, I don't have the historical knowledge on it, but that is that contributing to the challenges that we're having now?
Oh, absolutely. Because the schools are not the same size.
Right.
So they're not meant to be 50-50 split. That's truly just the heart of the issue, is that Scotts Ridge is smaller than East Ridge. So it really was, never meant to be all 3 schools going to one school and all 3 schools going to another.
And
Karen, do you remember, did that come up in the deliberations at the time? Or was enrollment not an issue? And what was the—
Oh, no. When the decision was being made,
yeah.
We actually, I do remember saying, well, we should wait a year because it's going to be really tight next year by the numbers. So yes, enrollment was certainly looked at and was, a concern at that time. So you'll see even from the memo from Dr. Baldwin at that time, instead of dropping a team of 4 at East Ridge, she recommended a reduction of only 3 FTE because she's assumed that there would need to be overages at Scotts Ridge, that there would be large class sizes.
Thank you.
But Karen, just so that I'm clear, because I will say this, is that the administration of Scotts Ridge, probably from the moment my feet were on the ground, raised the concern about the 50-50 split. And I know that advocated at that time, but is my understanding correct, Karen, that the primary reason that it happened during budget season was to save staffing?
Yes. So going back to Liz's earlier point, this conversation about being good stewards, could we close a school, actually started back in 2010. And so we'd been monitoring enrollment and looking at their scenarios. So when I had said last week or last time with Liz, we looked at scenarios, I was not referring to Malone and Bruins. I was referring to in-district work that I don't think you guys have seen through the packet. So when it came to, and that was under Deborah Lowe. So when Dr. Baldwin came, we had already been talking about, at some point with declining enrollment, do you think we could drop a team at East Ridge? Our intent was to wait until East Ridge, or till the enrollment naturally, don't redistrict, just when it naturally dropped enough, we could close a team at East Ridge. But during that budget cycle, it was, well, we can force it by redistricting to be able to reduce the team at East Ridge. That was not the original monitoring, but when we were getting close, it was like, wow, maybe that. And so that's why she did that during the budget season.
All right, so I'm going to ask the unpopular question. Why wouldn't we then just go back to a 60-40 split? Like just go back to exactly the way we were?
So there's a couple of ways we could do that, right? We could stay with the aligned feeder and redistrict, draw the lines further up the town to bring more of the elementary schools down to the 3 lower schools, depending on their capacity. In which case, why wouldn't we do that?
Right.
You look at the capacity at the southern schools.
Yeah.
And hopefully be able to draw them so that they although it seems like Ridgebury has the largest capacity, if I'm reading data correctly,
But I guess my question was a little bit different, Jonathan. So I know we could do that, but what would have been if the primary purpose in the shift is what Karen described? Why wouldn't we have gone back to that Barlow Mountain, Scotland shift? Like, why wouldn't we go back to exactly what we had? I'm just curious.
I think while it wasn't a strong feeling, the general consensus around the Zoom room was that the aligned feeders was generally better for the students in some way.
Were there transportation benefits to doing it that way too? I don't know, but when I think about splitting up 2 different schools, I wonder, that seemed weird to me from a transport perspective. You know what I mean? Like if everybody lives in the same neighborhood that goes to Barlow and you're going to split them and then you've got Scotland.
Same bus.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
I just wonder if there were transportation.
The only
Go ahead, Rick.
the only transportation issue was for a while, maybe for 2 years, we had 2 buses on the same road going to 2 different middle schools at the same time.
That's what I mean.
So,
But it-
yes,
yeah,
no. Rick is correct. No, Rick is correct. So what
Right.
Liz, your point was, when that bus goes to Barlow, it's going from Barlow to that person's house. It's not going to Scottsbridge or Eastridge. So it really doesn't matter which middle school they're going. It's going from Barlow to their residence.
Right, but what I
Okay.
was saying is when they split them up, you could have the scenario you guys just described that you
We
have.
did. So it was
buses.
increased. It was not, yeah, it definitely was increased, but that was because of saying if you had started at the school, we're not going to move you
Oh, it
again.
was only during that transition period, because what I didn't
Yes.
understand was part of Scotland and part of Barlow went to Eastridge. Instead of half of Barlow went to Eastridge and nobody from Scotland did. That's what.
Right, but
I wasn't-
so I can easily just say
That
Scotland,
makes
for
sense.
example.
Yeah.
So again, those buses from Scotland are only going to the resident, does not matter which middle school they go to. Okay. So then now if you're going into the residence to the middle school, so, that scenario, the schools were the residence was actually closer to each of it. So for example, over by Ballard Park are Scotland houses, but they're not far from Eastridge at all.
Right.
So those are the ones that would be going to
They
Eastridge.
carved
So
those
it did
out.
not
Okay.
impact. Okay.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I think that goes back to the redistricting at 2004, because some of those roads are so close to Veterans Park and they're going to Scotland.
Is
Right.
that
Was that when Barlow opened, Rick?
Yes.
when it changed?
Yes.
Okay.
So would that solve the immediate problem though?
Yeah.
If we were to go back this year, would that solve? So we've got this immediate issue of overcrowding, right? Would that solve it, knowing that 3 to 5 years from now, we may do something entirely different? I mean, I don't know what the community outcry would be on that either. I have no idea, but.
Well, I think that the natural outcry is the moment before anyone knows a single person, it's old building versus new building. That's the reality. We have it now, right? When parents school shop, they look at which school
Yep.
regardless of how consistent the educational experience and how excellent the teachers are,
Yep.
they school shop. So that's going to be the natural, and by the way, they could have school shopped in a different way, but that could
Yeah.
be one challenge. So I think there'll be some outcry there. I think there'll be anytime there's a change, because you don't always end up in the class with your peers anyway, but you're a part of a community, a 5th grade community, and you're expecting to transition into middle school with your community, despite the fact that you're going to integrate with a couple of others. So I think that there are those families that were not going back. What Kathleen said is you need to give them time, right? So we know we're going to be in this position for this coming year. And if this is going to be the plan for a year out, then we really need to
Start
prepare. We need to prepare.
Susie, can I make one comment to that? Just what conversations that boards and superintendents have had is I said Scotland and Barlow split before the aligned feeders for the middle schools. So now the conversation went to, well, if we all want you to go to the same middle school and you can't, now you can't even go to your own elementary school. Now you have to go to a new elementary school. So not only do you not go to the same middle school with your friends, you don't even go to the same elementary school with your friends. And that was something where, why we did not redistrict, or the district did not redistrict over many years, was because, they were solving a problem by perhaps creating a problem, which is a temporary one. Again,
Right.
people, adjust, but they chose not to, just so that you understand the rationale of why that did not happen previously.
I just got a note from Margaret, who's having some audio issues, but she's firm on keeping the aligned patterns, work to get it 60-40. But that her kids were at Barlow before the split, and she does value the aligned pattern at this point. And I have to say I do too. It makes sense to me that the student that I was sitting next to in 5th grade is also going to be one of my peers in 6th. Or that I'm not meeting all new people in 6th grade.
Well, especially these next couple of years. I mean,
Right.
everything's getting so screwy for these kids. I think we have to think about that. As I was thinking about it as we were talking, I'm going, if I was a parent with a kid in 5th grade right now and you told me I had to change anything, I would be,
Right.
I've had enough. There's just enough change. So is there another way though? We still have to solve for the overcrowding at Scotts
Right.
Ridge.
There is another way. And it was in one of the other reports from some years back, but it was increasing the size of Scotts Ridge.
I'd read. So if we're going to go down the capital discussion route, I'm going to throw a crazy idea out there and say,
We should look
Okay.
at crazy ideas.
why not take the land of Scotland and Barlow and build? We can need a new pool. We need a new school at some point. We know the town wants VP. Maybe we make that a middle school campus to beat all middle school or high school and switch the way the buildings are being used today. That's my crazy idea.
Or one elementary school.
Or one giant, beautiful elementary school with a giant, beautiful pool.
Well, you have a beautiful Barlow. And you have, great folks at Scotland, but there's potential there. I mean, the reality is Scotland, even though you look at the capacity study for Scotland, it's just not true. You have teachers teaching in halls.
Yeah.
You have teachers teaching. You go through Scotland, you have our priority kids being educated in hallways. So the utilization has its own way of utilization, but the reality is, practically speaking, it's not appropriate, number one.
Yep.
In addition to not being appropriate, I won't even get into the other things that it might be causing.
Yeah.
But go ahead, Karen.
So when back in 2000, it was probably about between 2010 to 2014, when the district was seeing if we could close a school, one of the concepts was, and they called it a supersized Barlow. And that was taking over the child care center that was there as well, and converting that into usable classrooms.
And what was the challenge with that at the time?
So the challenge with that was multiple. So there was the actual size of Barlow and the ability of having actually too many students for the capacity of like the cafeteria and the gymnasium in certain places, and the probably the facilities part of it as well. So I'll try to resurrect what all those were, but those are the two that come to my mind, as well as the congestion of the transportation of having two schools there with one that size.
Yeah, that's in the
Already
November
a challenge.
2016
Okay.
book, and it does say that that only moving Children's Corner out of Barlow Mountain does not open up enough seats to make elementary school closure sustainable and long term. So it was, again,
Right. That wouldn't equate for VP being closed for sure.
Right. Okay.
I mean, while jumping on what Liz says, if we're doing pie in the sky and you create a middle school that accommodates the whole town, which is basically in the middle of town, and then Scotts Ridge and East Ridge, do they become resurrected as supersized elementary schools, thus reducing the number of elementary schools, thus reducing and making transportation easier? I know this is a lot, but right now I'm just throwing.
No,
pie
it
in
makes
the
sense.
sky.
It does, but just from an educator perspective, when you create supersized elementary schools, you're shifting the culture. And I think there is a sense of culture and community that comes from, why do they want their schools? Because they're small, they're neighborhood schools, they appreciate that. Once you expand, and I actually feel differently, Kathleen, from middle school, because I do think that there's ways to make a large middle school feel smaller. I feel like elementary school, I don't feel, and I think that part of that discussion would need to come with just not my own personal perspective, but some research around this for sure. But I do think that it changes the culture that, and I don't know this community well enough, but what I do know, that this community values. And so I think we need to think about what supersized means for middle-aged kids versus little people, and the crowds and the transportation and just the busyness that might come from that type of setting. Although I do think a school like Scotts Ridge, for example, you may not be able to combine 2 elementary schools, but maybe 1.5, and perhaps looking at somewhere else to expand a little bit. So I do think that these are all options. And I don't, again, going back to solving what we have to solve for, and then identifying a study that we can jump right into to say, okay, what are those long-range plans that we would like to consider, and bringing all of this to the table with a lot of experts that can shine some light on what we want to see happen.
Well, and I think that the reality is we can't wait too long, because the town does have a looming opportunity for us, and it is an opportunity. They have needs, we have needs. It's symbiotic, actually, at some level. And if you could make it work, that you create a middle school that is centralized, you might be able to use one of those other buildings for flex for when we have enrollment challenges, right? Where we say it up front, like, hey, sometimes 9th grade is going to go down, or 5th grade is going to go up, or you do something that could segregate it out. I don't know, but I've seen larger districts do that kind of thing, where you kind of know if you're in a big class, you might be in X or Y because they're on the same grounds. It doesn't change your transportation. So there is opportunities to get creative, but I also think there is a bit of a deadline, and we should talk to the town about that and understand what they're really I mean, they've been talking about that since I moved here, so I don't know how looming that is, but I do know we may be able to capitalize on the opportunity, which would be pretty cool. And if not, then we know we can't, and we have to figure out plan B. But I know there's also, there is some facilities that maybe we don't want to invest in as much if we make these decisions in a reasonable time frame. I'm not saying too quickly, but in a reasonable time frame, perhaps there's some cost avoidance that we would have to use for this study, or whatever environmental stuff we need to do and all that.
So if I could just jump in, a couple of things, Dr. De Silva, what you said about supersized middle school making sense. I agree. I mean, the district you came from now has 1 middle school. When I was there were 2. It seems to be working well. But a number of times I've heard in this town, people saying that they value the neighborhood school on the elementary side. Makes me cautious about the idea of a supersized elementary. I do think maybe we don't need 6, but 2 giant ones I don't think would fly.
Right.
No.
Agreed.
Liz, to your point, timing is everything. The town is looking at spending a lot of money on a new fire and police. If that goes in now, I don't see bonding a new giant amount for the schools to be very likely, unless they say, wait a second, East Ridge would be perfect for a police and fire. I don't know.
I think it's worth a joint discussion on, at least, to say, does the timing line up, or what would the timing be if it could line up? Because it would make sense to go in together.
Yep.
And
I don't know.
I agree we should do this, but I also think to do all the logistical stuff without doing and really looking at educationally and philosophically 5, 8, 2, K3, K2, 3, 5. What is the size of elementary schools? We should have a mission about, or a focus on what we view as being appropriate for our community in terms of the structure of these, as we then look at all the logistical piece. Because if we come up with all this beautiful logistics, and then all of a sudden it does not fit into what we educationally believe in, it's not good. So I think that one doesn't go before the other. I think we really need to discuss what is a good elementary school? What
Yep.
does middle school look like? The 7, 8, 9. I mean, that was what happened when I was back in school as the old junior high. I think no one does that anymore, but
Too.
It was me.
Well, I think your point's good, Kathleen, in that I think we need to look at a lot of these things simultaneously. I mean, I think we can start a dialogue with the town about space while also having discussions about what makes sense from a curriculum perspective.
And this is where I think the administration is going to be, a lot of the work of this committee is going to be done by this committee, not by administrators, but for that kind of question, I would say, look to our administrators. What patterns do work and what don't?
Yes.
My assumption is that K2, 3, 5 are all fine. But then if you talk about an 8 through 12 high school, you might have a question there. So that's where I'm going to.
Yeah, so Jonathan, just to address that, when we knew, Deborah Lowe, a superintendent, knew that we could not fit by closing an elementary school, said, well, let's be as efficient as possible with our FTE, and proposed 3 K2 schools and 3 3-5 schools. So keep all 6 elementary schools open, but when you have less sites, you can be more efficient. So having 3 sites for K2 instead of 6 saved FTE. And the community at that time, again, communities change over 11 years, but at that time was very adamant and against it because families like the K5, they wanted their elementary kids together and not at different schools and to have more transitions. So yes, these are all great ideas, and I think we need to revisit them. So I just want you to know that is a topic that was discussed once, and I don't know where the community would stand now, but it does save FTE, definitely.
Educationally, not necessarily bad. Efficiency, it
Other
does save
districts do it.
FTE, but probably efficiency-wise, it probably does cost on the transportation.
Correct.
Yeah, and you might be able to pull that off with a Barlow, Scotland site, a K235, because they're close enough. But there's so many, just the added piece to this, there's a lot of different lenses that we have to navigate, right? It's the parent lens, it's the kids lens, it's the educator's lens. It's obviously costs and efficiencies and wherever we can find them. And then instructionally what's important and what we value. But I think I would just still take a step back, going back to that initial question. I know that we started off by saying, we're looking to solve the issue with the overcrowding at Scotts Ridge. We need to solve for that. Short term, obviously, because none of, we talked about pie in the sky, but really, these aren't really pie in the sky ideas. These are real ideas that happen in every school community, neighboring school. They're happening all over the place, right? So, but all we're saying is those are a little bit longer term conversations now, studying now, but a little bit longer term. But is the ultimate goal of those things, whatever they are, is it to navigate the aging facilities that are real, that are not innovative spaces? Or is it to save money? Or is it to bring all of our middle school children together? All of those can be real reasons, but I think we need to start listing what those are. And then I think we might be able to take more, I think it might become clearer how we need to solve for it once we can, and really you're right, Jonathan, what the board wants and what the board is looking for, and no plan on, educationally what I think is important. But what are we trying to solve for? And
so do we start like a Google Doc and start nailing these things down, or what's the best approach to start the brainstorming and offer up community input to get that, just the conversation started? What's the right protocol for that so that we can capture the conversation and start kind of walking through it with materials, so we can start kind of.
At least in the meantime, even if it's just for this group, I like the idea of a Google Doc or some other mechanism for us to brainstorm and collaborate between now and our next meeting. As opposed to coming into it cold.
And I would love to have in there the non-starters, right? From the educational community, what are the things that you're like, don't compromise on this? And I know, and I think the K-5 one is a good point. If you're going to have neighborhood schools, have neighborhood schools.
Exactly.
If you're not, then not. Those kind of things. And if they're just brainstorm ideas, they're things that you know, Susie, you're new to the district. You came in because it's a unique district and it's got a lot of opportunities. It's got a lot of strengths. I would love to see the things like, don't touch this. Don't screw it up.
Yeah.
You know, don't go back to 42 years after and not solve the problem anyway, that kind of stuff. But I mean, if there are some sort of constraints we can start to put on there too, so that we don't go so far off the path that we're messing with the educational magic that we have.
You know, I would say organizationally, that's a smart way to do it because you're meeting once a month, right? So if you can create a Google Doc where you can start listing some, and you don't have to agree on them, right? That's part of that can come to the table in public is here's a list of priorities that collectively we identified, and then you move them from these are reasonable, these are not reasonable, these are feasible, not feasible. Certainly from an educational perspective, we can weigh in as well. And at least it's a starting point of ultimately, you know, hopefully will be the goals that you can then say, okay, now we need feedback from all the constituents. We need to have the conversations with A, B, and C, and let's have at it.
Agreed.
But I still think you have to come back to that short-term piece is what are the next steps with, you know, what's going to happen in a year, or really even next year is tight, but what's going to continue to happen as we evolve. Because even if you build a great school, that's not going to happen even if you decided tomorrow, right? It's not going to happen. You're going to, you know, be 2-3 years out. So what needs to happen with Scotts Ridge soon?
So maybe Ken, if you and Dr. De Silva can discuss between now and next time how best to put together a shareable collaboration document, look at any FOIA restrictions that might be out there, and put something forward for the rest of us, that'd be great. Yep,
I think we can do that over the next week. That way, you know, we'll have a few weeks for us to actually use the document before the next meeting. If that works with Dr. De Silva.
Works for me.
Okay. All right. Did we want to?
Yes, 7 minutes.
Yeah. Did we want to discuss transportation at all? And think we can get it in 6 minutes?
Actually, I think we can.
Okay.
So Dawn,
Want me to share my screen?
Yeah. Why don't you share your screen, Dawn? And then what I'm going to do is, in the interest of being concrete, I'm going to add a slide so that we can just type into it, or I can type into it when we get to it. Okay?
I'm not in the Google part.
No, that's fine. I'm going to use the Google part.
I'm not in Google though.
No, you don't have to.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready, Dawn, you can start.
Okay. So we threw just a couple of slides together to get the conversation started around transportation. Our goal tonight would be to get the committee to give us some guidance on putting a proposal together and reaching out to some area or to some transportation, and why I want this, providers that we put together based on some feedback from other districts, along with some consultants that we have used in the district in the past as well. That way we can put together what we would like to see them to give us back as feedback, get this out to them, and then have them come and present to us as a committee where they think that what they think they can do for us for optimization and whatnot. So these are the various providers that we put together: educational logistics, obviously Edgelog, school bus consultants, transportation consultants, and school bus logistics. A little bit about each of them. They're pretty much similar in scope, where there are software, planning, routing, consulting groups. School Bus Consultants is a consulting firm, and they use independent third-party individuals or firms to advise schools and districts. Transportation Consultants Incorporated is also a consulting firm, and they do operations and distributions for transportation. And then school bus logistics is a consulting and support service for transportation and school bus contracting companies.
Dawn, if you wouldn't mind just pausing there. So these particular vendors or providers came from Dawn actually reached out to her CASBO group, which is the Connecticut Association of School Business Officials in Connecticut. So that reaches out as far north as north can be, and then where we are, and asked which providers they've used for transportation logistics, optimization studies, efficiencies, et cetera. Through her list and also reaching out to my colleagues, this is how this list was generated here. So you'll notice that Edulog and school bus consultants, for example, and maybe even school bus logistics historically have done work in Ridgefield. So the names weren't exactly new to us, but these were groups that have been used, and people's experience has varied. So great, or it was okay, met some of our needs, didn't meet all of our needs. No different than I think we've probably experienced here in the past, but just so you understand where this list came from. I apologize, Mom.
Oh, no, that's fine. And so what we were hoping to bring for some next steps was to bring to the strategic committee your wish list or your recommendation to us as to what we should put together for these proposals, and a timeline and a completion, both for us and for the presentation back of the proposals that we hope to get from each of those, and any other transportation advisor groups out there that we don't have on our list. Happy to include anyone else. So we're looking for some goals and timelines to share with them. We'll get the proposals from the consultants, and then we'll bring back to the committee for their presentations, and then we'll have an idea where we want to go from what we find out from these individual groups.
So the last time we were here, this is what was just thrown out into the air. We want a cost optimization study. We want kids coming to school safely and on time. Then we had a short-term goal that was thrown out, which was flexibility with ridership, modernizing that. So obviously that's part of the work that we can still be doing with Edulog as well, which is who's getting on the bus, who's not getting on the bus. Long-term was just kind of thrown out there, was programs for less electric busing. Obviously that connects to the negotiations and the fleet that we use and all of that. Long-term goal, although it was identified as a big priority, was elementary students on the same tier. Then we had how is it connected to, the feeder schools, and if we make changes there. So there was a lot thrown out at us, and we just want to be sure that we're identifying exactly what this subcommittee is hoping to achieve, and or obviously the broader board. So Ken, I guess in the 2 minutes that we have, I'm not sure how you want to navigate this, but as we go and reach out to these companies, we want to be super clear on what it is that we're hoping to achieve. And then we'll have them come, that group or anyone else that we look to reach out to, have them come and do a presentation. And then this committee can opine, and we can move forward with whatever makes the most sense.
No, I missed part of, with my great connection issues, I missed part of what you said, but I'll watch the replay back and catch up on it.
The gist of it, Ken, is that the gist of it there is that we're looking to have very specific goals from the subcommittee on what you'd like this work to look like. So these are, I don't know if it's going to be, to a point where we need an RFP, maybe, but ultimately we want to know, what are the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve? Have these folks come out. Where do you feel the greatest sense of confidence is with which group? Let's hear a little bit about their companies. 2 or 3 of them, our suggestion is to have 2 or 3 of them come out, do 20-minute presentations one night to this subcommittee. If we need to add another meeting onto the calendar, we do. And then have the subcommittee opine, and then we can move forward. That's our recommendation, but certainly wherever this board wants us to go. And Ken, I see we're out of time and we have another meeting right now. So I don't know how you want to weigh in on this one.
Well, Yeah, just from a logistics perspective, how, you know, and I guess I'll look to Kathleen or Jonathan on just how would that work, struggling with us communicating these goals back to Dr. De Silva. You're on mute.
We
Is
are
there
out of
any
time.
way- Is
Right.
there any way?
I have to leave this and start a Board of Ed meeting.
Okay.
Perhaps maybe emails.
Email.
Okay.
And then.
Or a shared doc the same way we're doing the others.
Shared doc.
Well, that was my thought, Liz.
Saying, let's just do that.
Okay.
Okay.
I will set that up. And do I have a motion to adjourn?
Adjourn.
Liz, second. Kathleen? All right.